In 1908, one of America's richest men stood on 1,200 acres of empty farmland north of Chicago and began building a palace. The Italian Renaissance villa would cost $10 million, equivalent to $272 million today. It featured 20 marble fireplaces imported from Europe, twin lakes stocked with fish and swans, formal gardens designed by the most celebrated landscape architects in America, and a grand staircase built for one specific purpose, so his daughter could descend it on her wedding day. 20 years later, Jonathan Ogden Armour died in a London hotel room with $25,000 to his name. The company his father built had slipped from family control. The palace had been seized by creditors, and during the worst period of collapse, Armour had lost $1 million per day for 130 consecutive days. The second largest personal fortune in the world, gone. But that was not the end of the story. His widow took the stock certificates his accountants had declared worthless, waited 4 years, and turned them into one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in downtown Chicago. She rebuilt a fortune. She constructed her own mansion, and both palaces, the one that destroyed her husband and the one that celebrated her survival, still stand today. This is the story of how America's greatest meatpacking dynasty was built on blood, waste, and ruthless efficiency, and how it vanished faster than anyone thought possible. A story of spectacular wealth, catastrophic timing, and one widow's refusal to stay ruined. But to understand how a dynasty could lose everything, you first have to understand how impossibly rich they became. And that story begins not in marble halls, but with one farm boy who saw opportunity in what everyone else threw away. Chapter 1. Everything but the squeal. Philip Danforth Armour was born on a farm in Stockbridge, New York, in 1832. The fourth of 8 children who learned to slaughter cattle and render fat into soap before they learned much else. His father, Danforth Armour, ran the kind of hard-scrabble operation that taught practical lessons. Nothing wasted, everything used. By the time Philip turned 70, he would apply those lessons to build an empire that processed hogs, cattle, and sheep on a scale that made his childhood farm look like a backyard hobby. He liked to say he made use of everything from the animal, except the squeal. He did not get rich slowly. At 20, Armour left New York for California with money from his parents and a head full of gold rush dreams. But unlike most young men who headed west in 1852, he did not plan to mine. He watched the miners work and recognized something more valuable than gold. They needed infrastructure. While others dug holes, Armour hired out-of-work prospectors to build sluices that controlled water flowing through the mining sites. The work was unglamorous, but profitable. By the time he turned 24, he had earned roughly $8,000, equivalent to $280,000 today. With that stake in hand, Armour moved to Milwaukee in 1856 and opened a wholesale grocery business. The venture worked, but groceries bored him. What interested Armour was grain. In 1859, he partnered with Frederick Miles in the grain trading business, selling supplies to settlers heading west. Much of their profit came from salt and pickled pork shipped to wagon trains. This marked Armour's first real contact with the meat business. He proved skilled at it. By 1863, he operated the largest grain elevator in Milwaukee. That same year, a local meatpacker named John Plankinton approached him with a proposition. Plankinton had been running a successful operation since 1852, but he needed capital and business expertise to expand during the Civil War. Armour saw the opportunity immediately. The Union Army needed meat, contracts were being signed, fortunes were being made. The two men formed Plankinton, Armour and Company. At the time, Milwaukee sat at the center of Great Lakes commerce, connected by rail and water to both coasts. The partnership thrived almost from the start. Plankinton understood slaughtering. Armour understood margins, logistics, and how to turn chaotic markets into systematic profit. Together, they supplied government contracts, shipped meat east, and established export markets that would later stretch to Europe. But Armour was not satisfied with comfortable success. He studied competitors. He watched Gustavus Swift experiment with refrigeration in Chicago. He saw how the Union stockyards, which opened in Chicago in 1865, were transforming that city into the center of American meatpacking. The infrastructure was unmatched. Rail lines converged from every direction. Livestock arrived by the trainload, and the scale of operation dwarfed anything possible in Milwaukee. Armour began to understand something his partner did not. Milwaukee had given him his start, but the future belonged to Chicago. Still, he remained in Milwaukee through the early 1870s, expanding the business and watching the industry evolve. He was methodical, patient when it served his interests. By 1875, Plankinton, Armour Company had become one of the largest meat packers in the Midwest. The partnership had made both men wealthy. Then Armour told Plankinton he was moving the operation to Chicago. Plankinton disagreed with the decision and sold his interest in the firm. The partnership dissolved. Armour took full control, moved to Chicago, and renamed the company Armour Company. He was 43 years old, already rich, and convinced he could build something far larger than what he was leaving behind. He was not guessing, he was calculating, and he was about to make a single bet that would turn a comfortable fortune into one of the most staggering in America. What happened next required not skill or hard work, but nerve and a willingness to wager everything on a hunch about when a war would end. Chapter 2. The Bet That Built an Empire. In the spring of 1865, pork was selling at $40 per barrel in New York. The Civil War was grinding toward its bloody conclusion, and operators across the eastern markets were buying recklessly. They believed prices would climb to $60 or higher as the conflict dragged on, draining resources and creating shortages. Most traders bet on prolonged fighting. They invested accordingly. Philip Armour bet against them. He studied the war's progress with the same cold calculation he applied to slaughterhouse efficiency. By early spring, Confederate forces were collapsing. Sherman had cut through Georgia. Grant had Lee pinned at Petersburg. The mathematics were simple. When the war ended, demand would plummet. The Union Army would stop buying. Prices would crash. Armour predicted pork would drop to $18 per barrel. Maybe lower. He presented his analysis to his partners in Milwaukee. They gave him approval to act. Armour traveled to New York and began selling pork short at $40 per barrel. He sold as much as anyone would buy, locking in prices before the collapse he knew was coming. The war ended in April. Confederate surrender came faster than even Armour expected. Within weeks, pork prices collapsed exactly as he had predicted, bottoming out near $18. The speculators who had bought at $40 lost fortunes. Armour, who had sold at $40 and could now fulfill contracts by purchasing at $18, made a profit of $22 per barrel. The total take was somewhere between $1 million and $2 million, an astonishing sum at the time. According to biographers, this deal represented the most important business coup of Armour's early career. It elevated Plankinton Armour Company from regional success to major player. It proved Armour's instinct for reading markets, and it taught him a dangerous lesson about American capitalism, that with enough nerve and perfect timing, a man could become as rich as he dared to imagine. At the time, Milwaukee was still a major player in American meatpacking, but the industry's center of gravity was shifting. Chicago's Union Stockyards had opened in 1865, consolidating operations that had previously been scattered across the city. The yards covered over 300 acres and connected to every major railroad line in the country. Livestock arrived by the tens of thousands. The infrastructure was unlike anything Milwaukee could offer. Armour watched this development with keen interest. His rival, Gustavus Swift, had already begun experimenting with refrigerated railroad cars. Recognizing that fresh meat could revolutionize the industry if it could be shipped long distances without spoiling, Swift was moving aggressively into Chicago. Other major packers were following. The question was not whether Chicago would dominate the industry, but who would dominate Chicago. The money from the pork speculation allowed rapid expansion. Armour and his brother Herman entered the grain business and built several meatpacking plants in Milwaukee's Menomonee River Valley. The firm opened branches in Kansas City and established an export house in New York. Operations grew efficient and profitable, but Armour remained focused on Chicago. When he finally made the move in 1875, he did so with capital, experience, and ambition. He was no longer a young speculator taking risks. He was a proven operator building an empire, and Chicago gave him the canvas he needed. By 1880, Armour Company had become Chicago's most important business. The company employed thousands. Its facilities dominated the stockyards. And Philip Armour stood alongside Marshall Field and George Pullman as one of the city's three great titans of industry. Newspapers called them the Trinity of Chicago, three men whose wealth and influence shaped the entire city. But Armour's genius was not simply betting correctly on markets. It was what he did with meat once he controlled it. And that innovation would change American industry in ways that still echo today. Chapter 3. The Gospel of Waste. In the 1870s, American meat packers threw away more than they kept. After slaughtering hogs, they carved out hams, bacon, and pork chops, then discarded the rest. Bones, blood, fat, organs, hides, hooves, bristles. At the time, this was considered an unavoidable cost of doing business. All of it was waste to be hauled off at expense and buried in pits outside the city. The smell alone drove neighbors to fury. Local governments passed ordinances. Packers paid fines, but no one saw an alternative. Philip Armour looked at those mountains of discarded animal parts and saw money. He applied the same philosophy his father had taught him on that upstate New York farm. Nothing wasted, everything used. Armour began systematically processing byproducts that every other packer considered garbage. Bones became fertilizer and glue. Blood became more fertilizer. Fat rendered into soap and oleomargarine. Hides became leather. Bristles became brushes. Horns and hooves became buttons and gelatin. Internal organs were processed into pharmaceuticals. The company built entire subsidiary operations around waste products: Armour glue, Armour fertilizer, Armour soap. Each division turned disposal costs into profit. Centers. According to accounts from the period, one observer calculated that Armour made more money from byproducts than some competitors made from meat. The famous quote followed naturally. When asked what parts of the hog he used in his business, Armour replied that he made use of everything but the squeal. True to his word, the company manufactured products from materials other packers paid to remove. Waste became inventory. Disposal became revenue. But Armour's innovations extended beyond creative recycling. In 1878, the railroad refrigerator car was perfected by competitors. Armour immediately recognized its potential. Fresh meat had previously been impossible to ship during warm months. Ice cars changed that calculation entirely. When railroads refused to build refrigerator cars quickly enough, Armour built his own. By 1900, the Armour refrigerator line listed over 12,000 units on its roster, all constructed in the company's own car plant. It became the largest private refrigerator car fleet in the United States. The refrigeration revolution allowed Armour to expand in every direction simultaneously. The company opened branch packing plants in Kansas City, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. Business offices operated in New York, Liverpool, and London. Armour developed canned meats and exported them to Europe, opening markets that had never purchased American pork or beef. Distribution networks reached cities across the eastern United States where fresh meat had once been a seasonal luxury. Inside the Chicago plants, Armour pioneered assembly line methods for livestock processing. Not assembly. Exactly. Disassembly. Hogs moved along overhead rails past workers who each performed one specific task: throat cutting, bleeding, scalding, scraping, gutting, sawing. The carcass advanced from station to station until nothing remained but packaged meat and sorted byproducts. The system was brutally efficient. A skilled crew could process hundreds of animals per hour. The operation's scale became legendary. In 1893, Armour Company earned an estimated $110 million. The facilities employed thousands of workers under conditions that would later inspire Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. But at the time, efficiency mattered more than worker welfare. Armour paid laborers roughly $9.50 per week when the living wage for a five-person family was $15.40. When workers protested in the early 1880s, Armour fired the union organizers and blacklisted the leaders. He was building an empire, not a charity. By the 1890s, Philip Armour's personal fortune was estimated at $50 million. Armour Company had helped make Chicago and its Union stockyards the undisputed center of American meatpacking. The company's operations stretched across continents, its products fed millions, and Philip Armour himself had become one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the nation. But wealth alone did not satisfy him. Armour wanted to live like the magnate he had become, and that required a very different kind of structure than slaughterhouses and stockyards. Chapter 4. The Trinity of Chicago. At 5 o'clock every morning, Philip Armour rose from his bed in the mansion on Prairie Avenue and prepared for work. By 6, he was at his desk in the home insurance building on LaSalle Street, hours before the 300 employees who shared the massive, non-partitioned office space arrived to begin their day. Armour stood tall, weighing 250 pounds, and spoke bluntly. Few dared to cross him. He believed in discipline, punctuality, and relentless attention to detail. Prairie Avenue, where Armour lived, was the most fashionable residential street in Chicago during the 1880s and 90s. The 6 blocks between 16th and 22nd Streets housed over 50 mansions belonging to the city's industrial elite. Marshall Field lived at 1905 South Prairie. George Pullman's elaborate residence stood at 1729. Philip Armour's home, described by contemporaries as elegant but not imposing, featured a mansard roof popular in that era and a conservatory filled with rare flowers on its southern exposure. The 3 men formed what newspapers called the Trinity of Chicago. Field, the merchant prince who built the greatest department store in America. Pullman, the sleeping car tycoon whose company towns and labor disputes made national news. And Armour, the meatpacking magnate whose innovations fed the nation. Together, their combined wealth and influence exceeded that of entire state governments. Despite their power, the 3 maintained surprisingly modest routines. Occasionally, Armour walked to work with Field and Pullman, the 3 titans strolling north along tree-lined streets, while carriages followed behind in case of bad weather. They often met again at lunch in the dining room of the Chicago Club, where they occupied what members called the millionaire's table. After work, they sometimes returned to the club for poker. Armour had married Malvina Bell Ogden, and the couple had 2 sons. Jonathan Ogden Armour, called Ogden, was born in 1863 in Milwaukee. A younger brother, Philip Danforth Armour Jr., followed. Armour doted on both boys, but especially favored Philip Jr., his namesake, whom he groomed to eventually lead the company. Ogden attended Yale University but dropped out during his senior year to join the family business. He became a partner in 1884. The Prairie Avenue neighborhood represented everything wealthy Chicagoans valued about late 19th century urban life: proximity to business without sacrificing space, elaborate architecture without European pretension, wealth displayed through dignified restraint rather than gaudy excess. At the time, servants staffed every household, earning approximately $5 per week. Butlers and coachmen were often English, or in Pullman's case, former slaves. Most household workers were Irish immigrants, who became lifelong members of extended family circles. In that era, before federal income taxes, these households operated like small principalities. Each mansion required multiple staff members: butler, cook, laundress, maids, gardeners, coachmen, grooms, nurses, and governesses for children. The machinery of domestic life ran constantly, quietly, and expensively. Armour managed his household with the same efficiency he applied to slaughterhouses. Waste was minimized. Routines were established. Problems were addressed immediately. His 5 a.m. wake-up time never varied. He arrived at the office before everyone else, a practice he maintained for decades. According to accounts from employees, Armour believed that arriving early gave him psychological advantage. Workers who found their boss already at his desk worked harder. But for all his wealth and power, Armour faced the same labor tensions that plagued every major industrialist of the period. At the time, labor organizing in Chicago's stockyards faced violent opposition from every major packer. In the weeks before the Haymarket bombing of May 4, 1886, Armour encouraged colleagues to equip militias to suppress future labor actions. When butchers called for better pay and job security, he kicked out union workers without hesitation. Blacklists followed. The company's position was clear. Armour Company would run on Armour's terms or not at all. By the turn of the century, Philip Armour had achieved everything a 19th century industrialist could want: money. Power, respect, a company that dominated its industry. A social position among Chicago's elite, and two sons to inherit the empire he had built. Then, in January of 1900, disaster struck. Philip Danforth Armour Jr., the favored son, the namesake, the heir apparent, died suddenly while visiting his father in California. He was not yet 30 years old. The death was unexpected and mysterious. Some sources suggest pneumonia. Others mention the trip being connected to Philip Sr.'s own declining health. Exactly 1 year later, on January 6, 1901, Philip Danforth Armour died in Chicago at age 68. The empire passed to the son he had not quite prepared for leadership. Jonathan Ogden Armour inherited a company earning hundreds of millions annually, employing tens of thousands and operating facilities across the globe. But Ogden Armour was not his father, and the world he was about to enter would prove far more treacherous than the one Philip had mastered. Chapter 5. The Unlucky Heir. Jonathan Ogden Armour became president of Armour Company in 1901 by default. His younger brother, Philip Jr., had been the chosen successor, the son their father loved more openly, the one groomed to lead. When Philip Jr. died in California in January of 1900, Ogden shifted from supporting player to reluctant star. 1 year later, when their father died, Ogden inherited an empire worth hundreds of millions. An empire he had never expected to run alone. He was 37 years old. Ogden had attended Yale but left during his senior year to join the family business. He became a partner in 1884 and spent the next 17 years learning operations while his father and brother dominated strategic decisions. Now, suddenly, both were gone. The responsibility fell entirely to him. In 1891, Ogden met Lola Hughes Sheldon, known to everyone as Lolita. She came from Suffield, Connecticut, from old colonial stock. Her ancestor, Captain Jonathan Sheldon, had purchased 1,100 acres there in 1723, establishing a family with deep American roots. Lolita was brilliant, witty, and beautiful. She was also socially ambitious, chronically dissatisfied, and obsessed with being the best-dressed woman in Chicago. They married in Mexico in 1892. The marriage was complicated from the start. Lolita craved European sophistication and formal social rituals. Ogden focused on business. They occupied different emotional worlds even when living under the same roof. But in 1896, an event occurred that would define both their lives and reshape their priorities completely. Lolita gave birth to a daughter, also named Lolita Ogden Armour. The baby arrived dangerously premature, weighing only 3 pounds. At the time, incubators were experimental medical devices that few hospitals possessed. Doctors placed the infant in a newly invented apparatus, warning the parents that survival was unlikely, even with the machine's help. For days, the family waited. Philip Danforth Armour, the formidable industrialist who rose at 5 a.m. and dominated every room he entered, ignored the Board of Trade and his meatpacking operations entirely to sit beside his granddaughter's incubator. When doctors finally determined the baby would live, Philip Armour celebrated by giving the child $500,000, an extraordinary gift that demonstrated both his wealth and his emotional investment in the family's continuation. But little Lolita's struggles were not over. As she grew, it became apparent that she suffered from a hip misalignment that threatened to confine her to a wheelchair permanently. The Armours refused to accept that outcome. In October of 1902, they summoned Professor Adolf Lorenz from Vienna, one of the world's most famous orthopedic surgeons. Lorenz was known as the bloodless surgeon for his technique of manipulating bones without incisions. Assisted by 5 other doctors, including Dr. Frank Billings, who served as Marshall Field's personal physician, Lorenz performed a 2-hour procedure on the 6-year-old girl. He manipulated her anesthetized bones, announced that she would walk as well as any healthy child once the plaster cast was removed in spring, and presented the Armours with a bill for $30,000. They paid happily. The surgery worked. Young Lolita recovered fully. But the years of medical crisis had changed the family's dynamics. After their daughter's recovery, Ogden and Lolita Armour lived largely apart. A neighbor, Arthur Meeker Jr., later commented that when Mr. Armour came to their country estate, Mrs. Armour left it, and vice versa, like figures on cottage barometers that appear and disappear as weather dictates. Despite the strained marriage, Ogden proved remarkably capable at running Armour and Company. During his tenure, sales increased from $200 million to $1 billion. The company expanded nationwide and overseas, growing from a regional meat packer to the largest food products company in the United States. In 1918, Forbes ranked Jonathan Ogden Armour among the 7 richest Americans. His personal fortune in stock holdings was estimated between $50 and $100 million, making it the second largest in the world at the time. Ogden was not simply maintaining his father's legacy, he was expanding it aggressively. He donated $1 million to the Armour Institute in 1901, continuing the family's commitment to education. He became a founding director of the South Shore Country Club. In 1909, he served as a silent partner in the purchase of the Kansas City Post. He even bankrolled the pioneering transcontinental flight of Cal Rogers, entering the new world of aviation financing. But success in business could not heal what was broken at home. His daughter was recovering but had been kept isolated, educated by governesses because her parents felt it was nicer for girls not to attend school. His wife was restless and unhappy, and Ogden himself seemed caught between the demanding world of meatpacking and the increasingly complicated world of Gilded Age society. In 1904, he decided to do something dramatic, something that would give his wife the beauty and status she craved, his daughter a palace to grow up in, and himself a monument to what the Armour name could achieve. He would build an estate that no one in Chicago could ignore. The land was swampy. The location was inconvenient, and his wife knew absolutely nothing about it until construction had already begun. Chapter 6. The Palace Built as a Surprise. Lolita Sheldon Armour was visiting Vienna in 1904 when her husband purchased 1,200 acres of largely worthless swampland in Lake Forest, Illinois. She returned to Chicago sensing something had changed. Ogden was distracted, secretive, and unusually pleased with himself. Finally, he took her for a carriage ride north from the city. When they arrived at the property, construction had already begun on a $10 million Italian Renaissance palace. The land, the architect, the design, the vision. All of it was a surprise. Ogden had named the estate Mellody Farm. The architect was Arthur Hune, a designer who had worked alongside Frank Lloyd Wright and Dwight Perkins in the Prairie School before shifting almost exclusively to revivalist styles. Hune understood what wealthy clients wanted, not innovation, reassurance. His design for Mellody Farm drew heavily from northern Italian villas, with pale marble and rosy pink plaster walls, steep red tile roofs, and architectural details that suggested centuries of European tradition rather than new American money. The site itself required massive preparation. Much of the 1,200 acres consisted of low, swampy ground, unsuitable for construction. Hune directed workers to drain the wetlands, raise the elevation where the mansion would stand, and use the excavated earth to create 2 artificial lakes. The larger became Eagle Lake, the smaller Willow Lake. Both were stocked with fish and decorated with swans that glided across their surfaces. Construction took 4 years. From 1904 through 1908, workers transformed empty farmland into a self-contained world. The main house rose to 29,000 square feet, containing more than 20 rooms arranged across multiple floors. Inside, craftsmen installed 20 marble fireplaces, imported from Paris, Vienna, and London. Each was unique. Each demonstrated that cost was no obstacle. Mrs. Armour purchased an entire green-paneled room in London and had it shipped to Lake Forest intact to be installed in the mansion. The house included a bowling alley for recreation. A direct telephone line connected the estate to the Chicago stockyards, allowing Ogden to conduct business without returning to the city. And dominating the interior was a grand marble staircase that curved elegantly from the ground floor to the upper levels. Ogden told his wife the staircase had been designed with one specific purpose. Their daughter Lolita would someday descend those curving steps on her wedding day. Interior decoration was entrusted to Elsie de Wolfe, a woman who, according to the New Yorker magazine decades later, was credited with single-handedly inventing the profession of interior decorating. De Wolfe created a famous winter garden at Mellody Farm, combining exotic plants, elegant furniture, and dramatic lighting into a space that became the estate's signature room. Her work throughout the mansion reflected the same philosophy Philip Armour had applied to meatpacking. Nothing wasted, every element serving multiple purposes. Outside, the Armours hired two of the most celebrated landscape architects in America. Ossian Simmons designed the formal elements, cypress-lined terraces, symmetrical rose gardens, decorative fountains with soaring spray. His work demonstrated European refinement transplanted to the Midwest. Jens Jensen handled the naturalized landscapes. Jensen was famous for his prairie-style gardens that worked with native plants and natural topography rather than forcing formal geometry onto the land. At Mellody Farm, he created a distinctive teardrop-shaped pond, planted eastern red cedar trees, built stone retaining walls, and designed a council ring for outdoor gatherings. His work blended seamlessly with Simmons' formality, creating an estate that felt both manicured and organic. The grounds contained stables for horses, an orangery for citrus trees that could not survive Illinois winters, and its own power plant to generate electricity when most of Lake Forest still relied on gas lighting. Ponds beyond the two main lakes were stocked with additional fish. A large herd of deer roamed the property. Formal gardens transitioned gradually into meadows and then woods. The estate even had its own railroad station. The Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad ran through the property, and Armour built a private platform where trains could stop to deliver him to work in Chicago or bring guests to the estate without requiring them to travel by carriage from the public Lake Forest Depot. From the main entrance gates to the mansion stretched a 2-mile driveway. Visitors passed through ornate Italian Renaissance gates designed by Hoon, flanked by buildings that echoed the main house's pink plaster walls and red tile roofs, then proceeded along a carefully landscaped route that revealed the estate gradually, building anticipation. The total cost was $10 million, equivalent to $272 million today. At the time, the Lake Forest historian Edward Arpey called it the most pretentious of all the colossal housing, appearing in the town during that period. Good Housekeeping magazine in 1913 allegedly described it as the most beautiful house between New York and San Francisco, though that attribution remains debated. What was not debatable was the estate's impact. Mellody Farm announced that Jonathan Ogden Armour had arrived as a force equal to his father, that the Armour Dynasty would continue. That wealth, properly deployed, could create something that looked like it had stood for centuries, even though construction had begun only yesterday. When the Great Marble Staircase was finally completed in 1908, Ogden's vision was realized. The palace was finished, the surprise was revealed, and his wife, despite her chronic dissatisfaction, had to admit that it was extraordinary. For the next 13 years, Mellody Farm would function exactly as intended. A stage where one of America's wealthiest families could live like aristocrats while the machinery of industrial capitalism churned relentlessly in the background. Chapter 7. The most pretentious house in Lake Forest. On summer mornings at Mellody Farm, swans glided across the Twin Lakes while gardeners tended rose gardens that stretched towards cypress-lined terraces. Inside the Italian villa, servants moved through 29,000 square feet of marble floors and imported paneling, maintaining a household that required staffing nearly as elaborate as the mansion itself. The building functioned less like a home and more like a small hotel designed for one family and their guests. Lolita Sheldon Armour had finally achieved what she wanted. She became widely regarded as the best-dressed woman in Chicago, appearing at social events in gowns that cost more than most families earned in years. Her need for antediluvian formality found perfect expression at Mellody Farm, where elaborate rituals could be performed without interruption or compromise. She had a palace. She had status. She had proof that the Armour name meant something beyond stockyards and canned meat. But she still was not happy. The marriage remained strained. Neighbors observed the same pattern year after year. When Ogden arrived at Mellody Farm, Lolita departed. When she was in residence, he stayed in Chicago. They moved like figures on cottage barometers, appearing and disappearing according to invisible atmospheric pressure. Arthur Meeker Jr., who lived nearby and later chronicled Prairie Avenue society, noted the arrangement with bemused fascination. Their daughter, young Lolita, grew up in this peculiar environment. Her parents believed it was nicer for girls not to attend school, so governesses educated her at home. She was frail as a child, overprotected by a mother who worried constantly, isolated from peers. Yet somehow, instead of becoming weak and self-involved, she developed what observers called a plucky spirit. The girl, who had weighed 3 pounds at birth and spent her early years in medical crisis, proved stronger than anyone expected. Despite the domestic complications, Ogden ran Armour Company with impressive competence. The business expanded nationwide and overseas. By 1918, Forbes ranked him among the 7 richest Americans. His personal stock holdings were estimated at $50 to $100 million, the second largest individual fortune in the world. Sales at Armour Company reached $1 billion annually. In 1917, as a show of solidarity with the war effort, Ogden and Lolita dug up the lawns at both their Chicago home on 37th Street and Michigan Avenue and the Lake Forest estate. They planted potatoes. Photographs appeared in newspapers showing one of America's richest couples engaged in agricultural labor, demonstrating patriotic sacrifice. The gesture was largely symbolic, but symbols mattered during wartime. At the time, Lake Forest was transforming from farmland into one of Chicago's most fashionable suburbs. Mellody Farm stood as the crown jewel of that transformation, proof that the wealthy would travel north for beauty and privacy. The estate hosted occasional gatherings, though fewer than one might expect from such a grand property. Lolita preferred small, formal dinners where every detail could be controlled. Ogden used the estate more for rest than entertainment. The bowling alley saw limited use. The telephone line to the stockyards saw more. The daughter the estate was built for remained its most important occupant. The marble staircase waited for the moment Ogden had described to his wife during construction. In June of 1921, that moment finally arrived. Lolita Ogden Armour, now 24 years old, married John J. Mitchell, Jr. in an elaborate ceremony at Mellody Farm. Mitchell was a wealthy Chicago banker, and together the couple represented the union of 2 of the largest fortunes in the city. Lolita descended the grand staircase wearing her mother's wedding gown, exactly as her father had envisioned 13 years earlier. The wedding was the high point of Mellody Farm's social history. It demonstrated that the estate could fulfill its intended purpose, that the Armour Dynasty was continuing into a new generation, that the family's wealth and status remained secure. None of the guests watching the bride descend that marble staircase could have imagined what was about to happen. Within 6 years, the entire fortune would collapse. The palace would be lost, and Ogden Armour would die in London with less money than some of his former workers had saved. The catastrophe began not at Mellody Farm, but in boardrooms and grain markets. And it started with what seemed like a brilliant strategy for wartime expansion. Chapter 8. $1 million a day. In 1917, to finance Armour Company's wartime expansion, Jonathan Ogden Armour made a decision that would ultimately destroy him. He sold $60 million in bonds to the public. The company was growing. Profits were soaring. The war created unprecedented demand for meat. Everything seemed to be working. Investors purchased the bonds eagerly, confident that Armour Company represented one of the safest investments in America. 2 years later, in 1919, those bonds converted to stock. For the first time in its history, Armour Company became a publicly traded corporation. Ogden remained president and the largest individual shareholder, but he no longer controlled the company with the absolute authority his father had wielded. He now answered to other investors. He had obligations beyond family interest. Then the world changed faster than Armour could adapt. When World War I ended in November of 1918, Ogden made predictions about the post-war economy that proved catastrophically wrong. At the time, his predictions seemed reasonable to many observers. He believed Germany would rise quickly from the ashes of defeat, rebuilding its industrial capacity and becoming a major trading partner. He believed Britain, exhausted by war, would decline economically. Both assumptions appeared logical based on wartime patterns. Both were wrong. Germany collapsed into hyperinflation and political chaos. Britain, while weakened, remained a dominant economic force. And the American economy, which Armour expected to boom indefinitely, slid into a sharp recession. Demand for meat plummeted. Prices fell. The company that had thrived during wartime expansion suddenly faced a market with no appetite for its products. Between 1919 and 1921, Armour Company lost $125 million. The losses were staggering, nearly incomprehensible. The company went $144 million into debt. And Ogden's personal fortune, tied almost entirely to company stock, began evaporating. He had gambled that post-war recovery would be swift and profitable. Instead, he watched helplessly as markets collapsed and his stock holdings became worthless paper. At the worst point, Ogden lost $1 million per day for 130 consecutive days. Let that sink in. $1 million every single day for more than 4 months. His personal stock losses exceeded $100 million, equivalent to roughly $1.47 billion in later valuations. This was the second largest personal fortune in the world, and it was disappearing in real time. Desperate to recover, Ogden made additional bets that only worsened the situation. He invested heavily in wheat speculation, convinced that grain prices would rise as European agriculture recovered. He was wrong again. Wheat speculation losses exceeded $100 million. The Armour Grain Company, a subsidiary operation, lost another $50 million. Every attempt to recover only accelerated the collapse. During this period, Ogden wrote 2 books attempting to explain modern business challenges. The Packers, The Private Car Lines, and The People appeared in 1906. Business Problems of the War was published in 1917. Both books demonstrated his intelligence and his understanding of complex economic systems. Neither could save him from the disaster he had created through spectacularly bad timing. In 1911, Armour and 9 other meat packers had been sued by the federal government for violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Armour convinced the other owners to let the case go to the jury without offering a defense. Surprisingly, they were all acquitted. But the legal victory meant nothing now. The government was not destroying Armour Company. The market was doing that without assistance. By 1923, the situation became untenable. The company's board ousted Ogden as president and replaced him with F. Edson White. After 22 years leading Armour Company, after expanding sales from $200 million to $1 billion, after being ranked among America's richest men, Ogden was fired from the company his grandfather had founded. The losses continued even after his removal. The bank seized Mellody Farm, the $10 million palace that was supposed to establish the family's permanence. The estate that Good Housekeeping had called the most beautiful house between New York and San Francisco was gone, taken by creditors months before Ogden's death. He had lost everything: the company, the fortune, the estate, the social position, everything except a handful of stock certificates his accountants had declared completely worthless. But before the end came, something unexpected happened. The people who should have abandoned Jonathan Ogden Armour refused to leave. Chapter 9. What the Women Saved. The wife who had lived apart from her husband for years suddenly stood beside him. The daughter who had been raised in overprotective isolation revealed strength no one knew existed. And together the 2 Lolitas did something that shocked Chicago society. They wrote checks. In the face of catastrophic financial collapse, Lolita Sheldon Armour dropped the narcissism and chronic dissatisfaction that had defined her for decades. She demonstrated loyalty and practical determination that surprised everyone who knew her. Her daughter, young Lolita, showed the same plucky spirit that had helped her survive premature birth and childhood medical crises. Neither woman was willing to watch the Armour name end in complete disgrace. Together, they donated $7 million toward Ogden's debts. $7 million. An amount that would have purchased comfort and security for generations. They gave it away to protect the family's honor and settle obligations that were legally Ogden's alone. The gesture demonstrated both their wealth and their commitment. They were Armour's. and Armours did not declare bankruptcy. But the women were not the only ones who stepped forward. Ogden's nephews, Philip D. Armour III and Lester Armour, both men in their 20s, contributed an additional $8 million. They had inherited money from their grandfather's careful estate planning. They chose to use it attempting to save their uncle. The total family contribution reached $15 million, an extraordinary sum, but it was not enough to save either the company or the estate. The debts were too large, the losses too severe, the market too unforgiving. When Ogden and Lolita Armour lost Mellody Farm, they also had to settle personal debts to the company itself. They gave up their remaining shares in the meatpacking firm to resolve Ogden's $1.16 million personal debt to Armour and Company. Even that debt, settled with stock, was substantial. In later calculations, it equaled roughly $21 million. The collapse was total. The second largest personal fortune in the world, gone. The palace, seized. The company, lost. And yet, the family had preserved something more important than money. They had preserved honor. No one could say the Armours had hidden behind bankruptcy protection. They had paid what they owed, even if it meant giving away everything. In the summer of 1927, Ogden traveled to London, England. The trip may have been for business. It may have been an attempt to escape the humiliation that followed him everywhere in Chicago. Whatever the reason, he fell ill shortly after arriving. First typhoid, then pneumonia. His condition worsened rapidly. As news of his illness reached England's social circles, Lord Dawson of Penn, personal physician to King George V, attended to him. Even dying in a foreign city, Jonathan Ogden Armour received treatment from royalty's doctor. The Armour name still carried weight, even if the fortune did not. Ogden died of heart failure at 4:30 in the afternoon London time on August 16, 1927. He was 64 years old. According to estate documents, he had less than $25,000 in cash in his accounts. He also held stock in the Universal Oil Products Company, estimated at $3 million, but his accountants had reviewed those certificates carefully and declared them worthless. The company was failing. The stock had no value. The pretty pieces of parchment were souvenirs, nothing more. Claims against his estate totaled $18 million. Even in death, Ogden Armour owed more than he possessed. His widow took possession of those worthless stock certificates anyway. Lolita Sheldon Armour, the woman who had spent decades focused on fashion and social standing, examined the documents and decided to keep them. They were, she thought, lovely pieces of paper, suitable for framing perhaps, a reminder of what the family had lost. She had no idea those certificates would make her wealthy again. Chapter 10. The Company Without an Armour. While Jonathan Ogden Armour died in London with $25,000 to his name, the company that bore his family name was just beginning its second life. The meatpacking empire did not collapse when the Armours did. It simply found new owners who understood what Philip Armour had known from the beginning. That waste was just another word for opportunity. In the early 1920s, the Armour family sold its majority interest to Frederick H. Prince, a Boston capitalist who brought both capital and stability to the failing operation. Prince was everything Ogden was not: calm under pressure, conservative in strategy, willing to rebuild slowly rather than gamble on quick recovery. He also brought his cousin, William Henry Wood, a junior bank officer with no experience in meatpacking, but considerable talent for management. Prince made an unusual decision. He legally adopted Wood as his corporate heir. With one condition: Wood had to attach the Prince surname to his own. William Henry Wood became William Wood Prince, and the hyphenated name carried expectations. Wood Prince would learn the business, master its complexities, and eventually lead Armour and Company into a new era. It seemed unlikely to work. Wood Prince was a former Army captain who knew banking, not butchering. He had never worked in a slaughterhouse. He had never managed large-scale industrial operations. He had never dealt with labor unions, government regulators, or the brutal economics of commodity pricing. But Prince had seen something in his cousin that others missed: an ability to learn quickly and lead effectively. Wood Prince proved brilliant. Under his leadership, The salvaged Armour Company retained its position as one of the largest firms in America through the Great Depression and the sharp increase in demand during World War II. At its peak, the company employed just under 50,000 people. The operations Prince and Woodprints rebuilt were leaner than what Ogden had managed, but they were profitable and sustainable. And then, in 1948, something unexpected happened. Armour Company, which had made soap for years as a byproduct of meatpacking, developed something new. They added a germicidal agent called AT7 to their soap formula. The agent limited body odor by reducing bacteria on the skin. The new soap offered 24-hour protection against odor-causing bacteria. They named it Dial because of that around-the-clock effectiveness. Armour introduced Dial soap with a full-page advertisement using scented ink in the Chicago Tribune. The marketing was innovative, the product worked, and during the 1950s, Dial became the best-selling deodorant soap in the United States. In 1953, the company adopted a slogan that would run for decades. Aren't you glad you used Dial? Don't you wish everybody did? The phrase became one of the most recognizable advertising lines in America. Throughout the 1960s, the Dial brand expanded to include deodorants and shaving creams. The consumer products business became so successful that in 1967 it was incorporated separately as Armour Dial, Incorporated. Meanwhile, the last member of the Armour family quietly left the company. In January of 1931, P.D. Armour III, grandson and namesake of the founder, resigned as first vice president. He was the last Armour to hold an executive position in the corporation Philip Danforth Armour had created 7 decades earlier. The family name remained on the door, but the family itself was gone. William Woodprints and his wife Eleanor became prominent American philanthropists, eminent art collectors, and leaders of Newport and Chicago society. They proved that Armour Company could thrive under leadership that had no biological connection to its founder. The business survived because it adapted. In 1970, Greyhound Corporation, the Chicago-based bus company, acquired Armour Company in a deal that surprised industry observers. 1 year later, Greyhound relocated the headquarters from Chicago to Phoenix, Arizona, moving into a new $83 million building. The meatpacking operations that had made Chicago famous were being managed from the desert. The corporate evolution continued through acquisitions, mergers, and reorganizations. Today, the Armour food brands are split between different owners. Smithfield Foods owns the refrigerated meat products sold under the Armour Meats label. ConAgra Brands owns the shelf-stable canned products like Armour Star Hash, Chili, Vienna sausages, and Treat. The pharmaceutical division became Armour Pharmaceuticals, eventually acquired by Forest Laboratories. And Dial Soap, the product that emerged from meatpacking waste in 1948, continues as one of America's most recognized consumer brands. The Armour name endured, but it endured on soap bottles and cans of chili, not in marble halls or Italian villas. The company outlasted the family. The brand survived while the fortune vanished. Philip Armour's obsession with using everything but the squeal had come full circle. Even the company's corporate identity was recycled, repurposed, and kept useful long after the dynasty that built it was gone. And the palaces the Armours left behind? Those were about to begin transformations of their own. But before those transformations could happen, one woman had to do something almost no one in her position had ever managed. She had to rebuild a fortune from nothing. Chapter 11. The Widow Who Refused to Stay Ruined. The pretty piece of parchment turned out to be worth a fortune, but it took 4 years, perfect timing, and Lolita Sheldon Armour's own shrewd business instincts to turn those worthless certificates into one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in downtown Chicago. After Ogden's death in August of 1927, Lolita found herself in a position that would have destroyed most people. She was 58 years old. Her husband had died owing $18 million. She had donated $7 million of her own money trying to save him. The palace she had lived in was gone. Her social position, built on wealth and status, seemed finished. But Lolita had kept those Universal Oil Products Company stock certificates, and in the late 1920s, something changed. The company had developed a revolutionary method of extracting more gasoline from a gallon of oil. The technology was called catalytic cracking, and it transformed petroleum refining. Suddenly, the worthless stock began to rise. By 1931, just 4 years after Ogden's death, the certificates Lolita had saved were valuable, very valuable. She sold her interest carefully, converting the stock into liquid assets at exactly the right moment. In 1932, she made her second brilliant move. She sold her interest in the Chicago Tunnel Terminal Corporation, a company that operated pedestrian tunnels beneath the streets of downtown Chicago. The tunnels were not glamorous, but they were profitable. Lolita took the proceeds from that sale and did something bold. She purchased the northeast corner of State Street and Madison Avenue, the intersection known as the world's busiest corner, the former site of Mandel Brothers Department Store, one of the most valuable pieces of commercial real estate in Chicago. The purchase reglossed the Armour name overnight. Lolita was no longer the widow of a failed magnate. She was a major property owner in her own right. Her net worth, according to later calculations, reached the equivalent of $133 million in modern terms. She had rebuilt the fortune her husband lost. But Lolita did not simply return to the life she had known at Mellody Farm. She had learned something during the collapse, that palaces built to impress others could be taken away, that social position based solely on wealth was fragile, that she needed something entirely her own. In January of 1931, the Chicago Tribune reported that Lolita Armour had moved into a house on land she owned in Lake Forest. She was planning something, and in 1934, she revealed what it was. She hired David Adler, one of America's most celebrated country house architects, and his equally talented sister, Frances Adler Elkins, to design a mansion unlike anything she had owned before. Lolita had met Adler through her nephew's wife, Leola Stanton Armour, who had commissioned him to build the Leicester Armour House. She knew his work, she trusted his taste, and she gave him clear instructions. This house would be entirely hers. Not Ogden's vision, not a palace built as a surprise, not a monument to the Armour Dynasty. This would be Lolita's house, built to her specifications, reflecting her preferences and no one else's. She named it Suffield House, after her birthplace in Connecticut. Not the Armour Estate, not Mellody Farm, Suffield. A name that connected to her family's colonial roots, to Captain Jonathan Sheldon's 1,100 acres purchased in 1723, to a heritage that had nothing to do with meatpacking or Chicago stockyards. The mansion Adler and Elkins created was a masterpiece. Neo-Georgian in style with strong French chateau influences, the house featured distinctive pink stone and a steep blue-slated roof. It contained 12 bedrooms spread across 15,000 square feet. The grounds included 18 acres of formal gardens, a 55-foot oval swimming pool, and a baronial hedge-lined motor court that gave the estate an air of English manor house elegance. Frances Adler Elkins designed the interiors with flamboyant 1930s style that contrasted sharply with Mellody Farm's heavy European formality. The sunroom became the house's signature space, featuring a checkerboard marble floor, plaster vines climbing the walls, a shell chandelier, and palm tree-like torchieres that created a tropical paradise in suburban Illinois. The original wall color was a bold tropical yellow. For the library, Lolita purchased centuries-old English paneling, complete with hand-carved crown molding, and had it transported intact from an old English home to Lake Forest. The room combined American scale with European craftsmanship, creating a space that felt both grand and intimate. Every detail was personal: the furniture, the colors, the proportions. This was not a house designed to impress Chicago society. This was a house designed for one woman who had survived catastrophe and emerged wealthy again through her own decisions. When Lolita Sheldon Armour moved into Suffield House in 1934, she had accomplished something almost impossible. She had lost everything when her husband's fortune collapsed. She had donated millions trying to save him. She had watched the palace she lived in seized by creditors. And then she had rebuilt a fortune, purchased prime real estate, and constructed a mansion that announced her independence and her refusal to accept ruin. She had proven she was more than just the best-dressed woman in Chicago. She was a survivor, a businesswoman, an operator who understood markets, timing, and the value of holding assets others declared worthless. But the two palaces left behind, the one that cost her husband everything and the one she built for herself, would face very different futures in the decades to come. Chapter 12. Two Palaces, Two Fates. When Jonathan Ogden Armour died in 1927, he left behind one palace. When his widow died in 1953, she left behind another. The first had cost $10 million and nearly destroyed a dynasty. The second cost far less and symbolized resurrection. Neither would survive as their builders imagined, but both would survive. After the bank took possession of Mellody Farm in 1927, the marble halls went quiet. The swans disappeared from the Twin Lakes. The formal gardens, once maintained by teams of groundskeepers, began to fade. The estate that had cost $10 million to build sat empty, waiting for someone to decide what a palace was worth when the dynasty that built it was gone. The bank's plan was to convert the property into a golf club. Lake Forest was growing. Wealthy families were building homes nearby. A prestigious golf course surrounded by the remnants of Mellody Farm's grandeur seemed like a logical use. But the golf club never materialized. The economics did not work. The timing was wrong. And so the estate remained in limbo, owned by a private foundation that had no clear vision for its future. Meanwhile, Lolita Sheldon Armour was building Suffield House. She had reclaimed her fortune. She had purchased valuable real estate. And in 1934, she moved into a mansion that represented everything Mellody Farm had not. Personal choice, independence, survival. She lived at Suffield House for nearly 20 years, managing her real estate investments, maintaining her social connections, and enjoying the house she had built entirely for herself. On February 6, 1953, she died there at age 83 after a long illness. Her estate was valued at $7.3 million, a significant fortune, though not comparable to the Armour wealth at its peak. The house passed to her daughter, Lolita Ogden Armour, who by then had divorced John J. Mitchell, Jr., the co-founder of United Airlines. The daughter had survived her own share of challenges: premature birth, childhood medical crises, her parents' complicated marriage, her father's financial collapse. She had married, divorced, and would marry again. First to Paul Wilder in 1943, then to William Howell Higgison in 1969. Through it all, she remained connected to the houses her parents had built. In 1958, 5 years after inheriting Suffield House, the younger Lolita sold it to Frank Keenan, a Cook County assessor, for $350,000. The sale was structured as part payment for a hotel and resort in California. Keenan immediately planned to dispose of the property, stating publicly that he could not afford to live there. The grounds were reduced from 18 acres to 6 as parcels were sold off. Suffield House changed hands again in 1971 when the Casati family, Roland and Arlene, purchased the estate. They arrived to view the property at the same time as another couple who brought an architect to assess renovation potential. The Casatis took one look at the plaster vines embossed on the sunroom walls, the centuries-old English paneling in the library, and the carved tree of birds over the fireplace, and made a decision. We won't change a thing. For the next 51 years, the Casati family meticulously preserved Suffield House. They maintained the original details Francis Adler Elkins had created: the checkerboard marble floor, the shell chandelier, the palm tree torchieres, the antique paneling. While trends in architecture and design changed around them, the Casatis kept Suffield House exactly as Lolita Armour had built it. In 1983, the estate appeared in the film Class, starring Rob Lowe. You as his character's family home. The address in the film was fictional, but the house was real. And it looked exactly as it had in the 1930s because the Casatis had preserved it with such devotion. Roland Casati died in 2022, and the family decided to sell. In September of that year, Suffield House was listed at $10.1 million. The grounds had been further reduced to 5.4 acres, but the house itself remained pristine. Over the next 2 years, the asking price dropped multiple times as the real estate market shifted. By May of 2024, the price had fallen to $5.5 million. In November of 2024, 71 years after Lolita Sheldon Armour's death, Suffield House sold for $5.7 million. slightly over the final asking price. It was the second highest residential sale in Lake Forest that year. The house Lolita built to prove her independence had survived through careful private ownership, passing from the Armours to the Cassatis to new owners who would carry it forward. While Suffield House was being preserved by private families, Mellody Farm was taking a very different path. In 1947, 20 years after the bank took possession, the private foundation that owned Mellody Farm sold the estate to Lake Forest Academy, a preparatory school looking to expand. In 1948, classes began in the mansion that had once housed one of America's wealthiest families. The school repurposed the building ingeniously. The great marble staircase where Lolita Ogden Armour had descended on her wedding day now carried students between floors. Classrooms occupied rooms that had once been private family spaces. The library became a study hall. Administrative offices filled other areas. The dining hall served students rather than the Armour family and their guests. Servants' quarters in the upper floors were converted into apartments. The mansion was renamed Reed Hall. It received designation on the National Register of Historic Places, recognizing its architectural and historical significance. And it continued functioning as an active part of the school campus, not a static museum, but a living, working building. Today, Lake Forest Academy occupies approximately 170 acres of the original 1,200 that Ogden Armour purchased. The campus has grown around Mellody Farm, incorporating the historic estate into a modern educational institution. Reed Hall also serves as a wedding and event venue, with rental fees of $30 per guest for access to the mansion and gardens. The revenue from these events helps fund the school. In 1999, the gatehouse that Arthur Hoon designed was renovated and reopened as the Lockhart Family Nature Center, serving as headquarters for Lake Forest Open Lands. The ornate gates still stand where they were built over a century ago. The buildings flanking them still echo the main mansion's pink plaster walls and red tile roofs. Portions of Mellody Farm became the Mellody Farm Nature Preserve, a 58-acre public space with 1.7 miles of trails. Visitors can walk through landscapes that Jens Jensen designed, seeing remnants of his work. The teardrop-shaped pond is still there. The eastern red cedar trees he planted still stand. Stone retaining walls mark the boundaries of formal gardens that have long since returned to meadow. The palace built to celebrate a dynasty became a school where thousands have learned. The palace built to prove survival became a home carefully preserved by strangers. One survived through purpose, the other survived through devotion. Both endured because someone understood what Philip Armour knew from the beginning, that nothing should be wasted, not even ruins. In 1908, Jonathan Ogden Armour built a $10 million palace on 1,200 acres. In 1927, he died with $25,000. His widow rebuilt a fortune and created her own mansion. Today, one house teaches students, the other shelters a family. Neither exists as their builders imagined. Both survived. The Armour story is particularly American. Philip Danforth Armour rose from a farm in upstate New York to become one of the richest men in the nation by finding value in what everyone else discarded. His son inherited that empire and expanded it, only to lose everything through catastrophically bad timing. But Lolita Sheldon Armour, dismissed as merely the best-dressed woman in Chicago, proved herself shrewd enough to rebuild wealth from stock certificates others called worthless. The palaces tell their own story. Mellody Farm, seized by creditors, became Lake Forest Academy. The marble staircase built for one bride now carries thousands of students. The formal gardens serve as nature-preserved trails. The building that once symbolized excessive wealth now provides education. Suffield House took a different path. Preserved for 51 years by the Cassati family who refused to change anything. Private care rather than institutional purpose saved it. The irony is inescapable. Philip Armour's greatest legacy is not Mellody Farm or the fortune he built. It is the Armour Institute of Technology, which became the Illinois Institute of Technology and still educates thousands annually. Meanwhile, the Armour name continues on dial soap and canned meats that emerge from waste products. The company survived. The family fortune did not. The Armour fortune was built on the principle that nothing should be wasted, everything but the squeal. In the end, Even the palaces proved that rule. Mellody Farm was repurposed for education. Suffield House was preserved through devotion. The company was salvaged by owners who understood waste could become profit. And the family name, though no longer attached to wealth or power, continues on products purchased by millions who have never heard of Jonathan Ogden Armour. Stone and marble last. Fortunes do not. What survives is rarely what we intend. And sometimes the greatest legacy is not what you build for yourself, but what others choose to do with what you leave behind. The gates Jonathan Ogden Armour built are still standing. The empire vanished, but the entrance remains.